Hi, class. This is a lecture that's going to deal primarily with chapters 15 and 16. Now, I know that for your reading assignments, I assigned you 16 and 17, but in order for 17 and 18 and 19 to make sense, it's good to look back at 16 too, 15 too. So we're going to look at 15 and 16 today. As you all know, this class is modern history, and in Western history, the modern era usually is considered to be the period from about 1500 onward. Uh, Basically, the period in which you begin to see uh, European countries begin to consistently explore and also be in a position to be dominant in a lot of regions. Now, this, of course, is a very Eurocentric way of looking at world history. And the book that you all have for this class, Panorama, attempts to look at the world more holistically and not focus solely on the West. I mean, that's one reason why, for instance, we don't see the term Europe used so much in the book as basically referring to Afro-Eurasia to refer to the Eastern Hemisphere, what people in my generation would have called the Eastern Hemisphere. Because although Europe does end up becoming very dominant, it doesn't do it in a vacuum. And even though it becomes dominant, it doesn't mean that other parts of the world don't continue to be important or don't continue to have a great deal of influence on the rest of the world. Now, really, the thing that I think is most important, if you're looking at chapters 15, 16, and 17, I think the single most important concept to get is that at the beginning of the period, if you're looking at 15, you're looking at history from, say, about 1300. And if you're looking at that period, first of all, the Eastern and Western hemispheres don't have anything to do with each other. As the book mentions, basically significant migration between the Eastern and Western hemispheres stopped about 12,000 years ago. I mean, there are some rare exceptions, like the Vikings. They were documented to have come to the Western Hemisphere several times in the 11th century, the 10th and the 11th, primarily 11th century. They were documented to have come to what nowadays would be Canada and Greenland. And there is some scattered evidence that perhaps the Chinese came to the came to the Pacific coast of North America or South America, but there was no consistent, sustained contact between the hemispheres really after the end of the last ice age until we get to the end of the 15th century. And so if we're looking at Afro-Eurasia, to use the terminology of the book, if we look at the period from 1300 to 1500, Afro-Eurasia was definitely a place in which the Asian portion of Afro-Eurasia was dominant. It had the biggest population, it had the biggest economy, it produced the items that were most desirable, it had the most advanced technology. Whereas the western part of Afro-Eurasia at this time was a backwater. I'm sure you all have at least some familiarity with ancient history. You know that the Roman Empire collapsed in what we would now consider to be the 6th century of the Common Era. And Europe went into what was generally referred to as the Dark Ages, a period in which European population greatly declined. Big cities ceased to exist in Europe. I mean, for instance, during the Roman period, during the Roman Empire, Rome became the first city with a population of over 1 million people. Once you get into the Dark Ages, and really from the 6th century until the 15th century, you really don't have cities in Europe with populations over 100,000 people. I mean, everything just shrinks. I mean, you end up getting very small towns. I mean, basically, for about a 700-year period in Europe, you don't really have any towns bigger than, say, Belleville, Illinois, or say Clayton, Missouri. I mean, you don't really have towns any bigger than that during that period. And so, in the beginning of the book, we see that Europe, the Western Europe, is very much at the periphery of the world economic system that is most dominant in Eastern Asia and also South Asia. What we would now call India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan were also major players. And then finally in Western Asia, or we see Persia, the area of the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, and Asia Minor, what nowadays would be Turkey, being major players, as well as North Africa. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa is a significant player too, but Sub-Saharan Africa, because of the Sahara, now a lot of times, like the book says Sahara Desert, but as somebody who has some training in Arabic, although I'm not really fluent anymore. Well, I was never really fluent, but there was a time I was decently conversational, but I'm not anymore. But one thing that I think is really important to understand is that the term Sahara comes from the term Sahara in Arabic, which means desert. So you really don't have to call the Sahara Desert a desert, Sahara Desert. Just let's call it the Sahara. I mean, because that means it's a desert, and it's a really big desert, the biggest desert in the world. But the point I'm making is that the existence of the Sahara constituted a significant barrier between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And so therefore, the people in North Africa who really served as the interlocutors between Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa only had limited contact with people in Sub-Saharan Africa. They usually didn't go any further than they could go on horses. And one of the things about Sub-Saharan Africa, as you get deeper into Sub-Saharan Africa, especially into the forested areas, the areas with heavier rainfall, these are areas where you really couldn't take horses. I mean, horses tended to die. They had diseases that took them out. And so that meant that, and then also the people who were on camels, camels don't like really wet, rainy places. And so that meant that the people coming from the north, they could get to the northern part of what we would call Black Africa, the part that's known as the Sudan or the Sahel. Sahel comes from the word in Arabic for shore. And people who crossed the desert looked at the desert pretty much the same way you would see the ocean, just like you can't drink salt water, you can't drink sand. And so once they got to the other side of the desert, then they felt like they were at the shore of the desert. And so the shore of the desert was known as the Sahel, which is a very significant area because that's where you had a number of larger civilizations like Mali. The earliest one was Ghana, but Mali. And you would also have oh my goodness, I'm drawing a blank right now. But you would also have, I can't remember right now. But you would have a number of other empires that would basically develop basically from the period of about the 4th century of the Common Era until about the 17th century of the Common Era. You had a number of states that developed in the Sahel region. Like I said, Ghana was the first one. Then you would go on into a number of other states that developed, over time. Mali would be the next state, would be the next one to develop. And they would come in and out of existence over time from the period of about 300 until about 1600. And then slightly to the east, you had another society, Kanem-Bornu, which would be in what nowadays is the modern day country of Chad, that lasted a very long time. It lasted over 1,000 years, and it was another one of the Sahelian civilizations. But anyway, let's move on a bit. Now, the interesting thing about chapter 15, it talks about how there were a number of things that happened in the period, say from about 1300 till about 1400, that really until the early 1500s, until it completely cleared up, that had the effect of breaking up some of the older empires and, reducing populations, but at the same time also kind of changing the social structure, especially in Europe. Now, one of these major things was the plague, or the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. Now, this was a disease that was carried by pathogens that tended to inhabit rodents, in particular rats. Now, in East Asia, it was indigenous. It was commonly carried in small critters called marmots, kind of like ground mice, ground squirrels. And basically, the bubonic plague got picked up by people in caravans and people in ships, and was gradually spread throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. And over a period of a couple of centuries, it really wiped out a lot of people. And in Europe, in particular, when it first broke out, it was known as the Black Death. And this was in the 14th century, from 1346 to 1352. Now, the interesting thing about the Black Death is that it tended to break up the structures of medieval society. Now I'm sure you all in other classes have heard about the Middle Ages, and this was a period in Europe in which you didn't really have big governments. You did, basically you had some kings, but they tended not to have a lot of power, and most power was in the hands of local lords. They might be dukes, they might be counts, and they would control territory, and the people who lived in their territory were serfs. Now, serfs were people who were not slaves; they couldn't be sold or bought, but they were not free to leave the land, and they were obligated to give the lord of the land a labor and produce crops for him. Now, the Black Death really had the effect of really accelerating the decline of the feudal system, because people got sick, people ran off, people died, and so this meant that a lot of people began to move around, and a lot of people began to move to cities, which from a public health standpoint, right now, hopefully we're coming out of the period of COVID, and one of the things we learned from COVID is that when you have a really bad disease, especially a disease that can be spread by air, by people breathing or coughing or whatever, what you don't want to do is congregate around a lot of people. And so at a certain level, when people escaped the countryside and moved into towns or whatever, it was not really what we would say nowadays, that's not a good idea. But when people didn't understand what disease was, and they basically saw disease as punishment from God, they were trying to run away from wherever they were to try to get to someplace better. And so the Black Death has an effect of really kind of undermining the social structure in Europe. And in the long run, this is good for Europe because it allows people to kind of move around, and it unleashes energy and creativity that was kind of under wraps before then. Now, the Black Death had a major impact all over the world. Like, for instance, the book mentions how the Yuan dynasty, the dynasty that was founded by the Mongols, collapsed in China, during this time. We also see a number of empires being attempted to be developed in Central Asia. Like, for instance, they mentioned Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane, as he's sometimes referred to in the West, who develops an empire, basically modeled on what the Mongols did, but it didn't really have any staying power. And it takes a while until ultimately you see the Ottomans, who are going to be featured, pretty heavily in this book, because the Ottoman Empire exists, manages to exist until the end of World War One. They come into existence and really become a major empire at the western end of Asia, whereas on the eastern end of Asia, we eventually see the Ming Dynasty being developed. Now, during the period that we're talking about, ultimately the Ottomans become a major power in Western Asia. Uh, the Ming Dynasty becomes a major power in Eastern Asia. And you continue to have a number of significant powers in South Asia, in China. And as I said before, you have a number of states coming into existence in Africa. Benin comes into existence during this time. You have the Kingdom of Congo, which is going to be talked about much more in chapter 16, coming into existence. And also, which is not mentioned so much in the book, is that you have a number of city-states that come into existence in East Africa, and in what we would refer to nowadays as the Swahili region of the East African coast. These are a number of you don't really have big empires there, but you have a number of cities that come in, kind of like Italy. Like, I gave you guys a film on Italy to watch. You have a number of cities that come into existence in East Africa like that facilitate trade, and these are going to be, and these areas tend to be dominated either by people from the north in Southwest or South Asia, or else there's a period where they're dominated by the Portuguese in the early 16th century. And like I said, I gave you guys a film on that too. So look at that film; you can get more detail on that. Now, one of the interesting things that happens, and this is one of the things that historians like to talk about sometimes, because history obviously is the study of what is, and not what could have been. But one of the interesting things that could have happened during this period happens, is during the 15th century, from about 1405 until about 1433, when you have the Ming Dynasty being created in China. You have a fellow by the name of Zheng He, who becomes an admiral for the Chinese Navy, who sends a number of voyages through the Indian Ocean from what nowadays would be Indonesia, eventually reaching the coast of East Africa, eventually reaching what nowadays is Kenya and Somalia and Tanzania. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the Chinese at this time had the best shipbuilding technology in the world. The Chinese junks were huge ships. I mean, really, it's not until you get into the 20th century that people in Europe and America make ships as big as the Chinese made in the 15th and 16th centuries. And during this time, the Chinese, they sent out some really huge naval expeditions with as many as 28 or 30,000, Marines on their ships, as well as a huge number of ships. And at that time, they were the absolute dominant military power in Asia. Now, really, the Chinese had the technology. They could have gone to the Americas if they had wanted to. I mean, obviously, they didn't really know they didn't know the Americas were there, but they definitely had the technology. They could have gone to Europe. They could have dominated Europe. But from the Chinese viewpoint, there was really nothing in Europe too much they wanted. I mean, the one thing that, if you look in chapter 16, they talk about how in the beginning of chapter 16, Europe, which is on the western perimeter of the Afro-Eurasian landmass, they want a lot of really nice goods from China. But the Europeans really don't produce anything the Chinese want. And so the one thing they can give them is gold and silver, primarily silver. The Chinese monetary system ran silver was their primary precious metal, as opposed to gold, which was the primary precious metal in the West and other parts of the world. And so silver and gold were really the only things that were produced in Europe that the Chinese wanted. But the Chinese didn't need to come to Europe to get them, because the Europeans, since they had nothing that the Chinese wanted, in order to get products from China, they had to constantly mine gold. I mean, constantly mine silver. Now, as the book mentions, it was not as much gold in Europe, but Europeans could get gold in Africa through. They could get gold from sub-Saharan Africa through traders in North Africa who maintain trade links in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, and so therefore, if you look at the period from 1300 to 1500, I mean, Europe is really kind of a backwater. It's not really important in the trading system of the Eastern Hemisphere. Now, what eventually happens, however, is that shipping technology comes to Europe. I mean, the Europeans are able to get this shipping technology primarily through contacts in the Middle East. They start getting things like compasses, astrolabes. Europeans themselves begin experimenting with sail technology and eventually develop the Latin sail, Lateen sail, which is very important because it allows Europeans to sail against the wind, especially if what they refer to as tacking. As the book describes, they couldn't sail directly against the wind, but they could kind of go at an angle and use the sails to kind of use the wind that was pushing against them to help them go in a different direction. That was a navigational technique they developed over time. But what we see is that as Europeans develop this sailing technique, and as they gradually explore, along, in the Atlantic, in the open Atlantic, and also as they continue to go south along the coast of Africa, they become much more proficient sailors. And so, in the process of doing this, they begin to colonize islands off the coast of Africa. Most of the islands are not inhabited. The one exception are the Canary Islands, which are inhabited by people who originally came from North Africa. These people spoke a variety of the Berber language, but by the time the Europeans came there, these people had been so isolated that culturally they were nothing like the Berbers, the Berbers in North Africa, who had become Muslim and basically become part of the Muslim world. These people, the Guanche, as the Spanish called them, essentially had Stone Age technology. So they had been isolated probably for thousands of years. They apparently they had gotten in boats, made it to Canary Islands, and then forgot how to use the boats. I mean, that happens sometimes. I mean, a similar thing happened in Australia, where people got to Australia, except for in Australia, it was 75,000 years ago, the earliest boat migration we know of in history. People came to Australia and gradually forgot how to go long distances in boats. In the case of people going to Tasmania, they even forgot how to make fire. And so the fact that the Guanche eventually forgot how to sail is not unusual. That happens sometimes. Sometimes people go places and, for whatever reason, they get comfortable where they are and they lose some technology that they had previously. But without getting too far off course, as Europeans went down the coast of Africa, except for the Canary Islands, all of the islands they found were uninhabited. This would go for the Azores, Cape Verde, and eventually as they got far south off the coast of what nowadays would be Democratic Republic of Congo and Gabon down in Central Africa, they eventually found the islands of Sao Tome and Principe. Those islands were uninhabited, and basically the Spanish got the Canaries, the Portuguese got the Azores, and Sao Tome and Principe and Cape Verde. And what happens is that these people began to develop plantations there using involuntary or slave labor. I mean, slave labor had been first developed, had first been used in the Mediterranean by Europeans, in this early modern period. And, that method of organization would be carried down there. Now, eventually, Christopher Columbus he would manage to convince the monarchs of Spain to finance his trip west. And he runs into something that he had no idea existed, the Americas. We're not sure where he landed first. I remember about 5 years ago, I was in the Bahamas, and they actually have a little marker saying that was where Columbus first landed in 1492. Now, the people who write the book say that we're not sure if that really was the place. I mean, although, if it's going to make people in Bahamas happy to say that, fine. And also, it's a cool thing to tell tourists when they come there. I know, as a tourist myself, it was kind of cool when I read it. But anyway, be that as it may, Columbus lands in the Bahamas. And now Columbus always thinks that he's somewhere off the coast of Asia. He just hasn't quite found his way yet. But other folks, put two and two together and realize that they are in to them at least, a new place. Now, obviously, the Americas weren't new. I mean, there have been people, nowadays it appears that evidence is appearing that people may have been in the Americas as long as 32,000, 30, or 35,000 years ago. But, as I mentioned before, and as the book mentions, contact between the hemispheres had ceased, many thousands of years before you had complex urban societies that we usually refer to as civilizations. And so therefore the two parts of the world did not know the other part existed. And so when the Europeans get there, Columbus, he gets there, they realize it's a new place. And we see a very interesting dynamic happen. And the book brings out this point. Like, for instance, when Europeans first come to Africa, when the Portuguese first come to Africa, they try to raid and they try to shoot it up to take what they want. But they soon realize that they cannot beat the Africans. I mean, even though the Portuguese have guns and the Africans don't, although the Africans eventually get guns, they get them pretty soon. At this time, in the 1400s, guns are not very good. I mean, you take a gun, it might take you 30 seconds to load a gun. You shoot it one time. Then you have to take another 30 seconds to load it. I mean, somebody could, put about 7 arrows in you while you're in the process of trying to load a gun. Or they could, put 3 or 4 spears in you while you're trying to load a gun. And so, therefore, guns weren't a huge advantage at this time. I mean, they were an advantage, but they weren't a huge advantage. And, since Africans had steel, as a matter of fact, steel was actually invented in Africa. That was something that for a long time, people thought steel was invented in what nowadays is Turkey. But as more and more archaeologists have done research, it's become clear that steel was actually invented in probably the Sahel zone of Africa, about 2,000 or so years ago. And so Africans had plenty of steel. They had big canoes, even though they didn't have modern ships. They had big canoes where they could come out and shoot lots of arrows at Europeans who might try to attack them. And so the Europeans, ended up doing business. Now, the other thing, too, is that when it came to disease, actually, Africans had an advantage because Africans had been exposed to the same diseases as Europeans. Stuff like smallpox or influenza, that kind of thing. But there were also tropical diseases like malaria. Now, you did have some malaria in Europe, especially in Italy. But you had a lot more malaria in Africa. And you also had stuff like yellow fever. You had stuff like dengue fever. You had a lot of diseases that didn't exist in Europe. And so this meant that Europeans, when they came to Africa, tended to have high rates of mortality. As the book mentions, now the book says Europeans died at a rate of about 25 to 50% of the ship's crews when they stayed in Africa for a long time. Now, I've heard some books say that as many as 75% of Europeans died. So Europeans soon realized that in order to do business in Africa, they needed to get in and out quickly. And it made sense to work with African leaders and not try to attack them. And so this meant that, even though Africa would end up being the major supplier of labor to the New World through the slave trade, through most of this period, Europeans didn't actually control most of Africa. I mean, there were African people who found it advantageous to engage in the slave trade. Now, ultimately, the slave trade would undermine Africa. Like, for instance, in the book they mentioned in chapter 16, the Kingdom of Congo, that eventually collapsed because of Portuguese pushing for the slave trade. And so, in the long term, it was not good for Africans, but at least in terms of trade, you found Africans who were willing to engage in the slave trade because they were able to get a lot of goods and money. However, when it came to Europeans going into the Americas, Native American societies quickly collapsed because Native Americans did not have resistance to European disease. Now, the reason for this is pretty simple. There were a lot of domesticated animals in the Eastern Hemisphere that did not exist in the Western Hemisphere. And really, the major source from which we get diseases quite often, epidemic diseases, are through animals. I mean, now, for instance, like COVID, which was a devastating disease the last couple of years. You know, it appears that that disease spread through animals that were in open markets in China. And, you know, that's nothing unusual. I mean, influenza is a disease that has come to human beings largely through birds and pigs. Tuberculosis has come through us through cows. You know, there are any number of diseases that we picked up from animals. And so, and really in the Americas, really the animals that were domesticated there, the turkey, the guinea pig, dogs, llamas, and alpacas, they didn't have those diseases. And so therefore, when people from Europe and Africa came to the Americas, it had a devastating impact on Native Americans. I mean, like, for instance, the book mentions when Cortez first attacked the Aztecs, he couldn't beat them. But, you know, after the Aztecs caught, you know, various diseases, especially smallpox, from the Spanish, it wiped them out. And the Cortez was able to come in largely because people were dropping dead. And so what we see is that with first the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then later the French, the Dutch, and the English getting control of territories in the Western Hemisphere, this completely flips the power dynamic in Afro-Eurasia. Europe goes from being this lonely, underdeveloped, underpopulated periphery of Afro-Eurasia into now becoming a very dynamic, quickly growing economic giant that is rapidly developing its military technology. And so this means that, you know, really from the 16th century onwards, Europe begins to push eastward with the power and the economic with the economic resources and power it developed by initially pushing westward into the Western Hemisphere. And so that really changes the dynamic. And we're going to talk more about this in the next lecture. Have a good day.